from Trinidad's point of view, but we will try to touch other areas in the world as well. Now, I'll give you a little brief background. Most of you will know that geographically, Trinidad is just off the coast of South America, just east of Venezuela. There's a lot of tension happening there these days. We don't want to get into that. Also, as far as the historical background goes, Trinidad was populated first by the Amerindian people. We still have some of them around, though mixed up with the rest of us. We also remember that Columbus came to us in 1498, and so started roughly 300 years of Spanish rule, with the French coming in very close to the end of that period with a cellular population in 1783. We also know that as a colony of Spain, Trinidad and perhaps the rest of the Caribbean islands were neglected because there was too much gold and silver. Gold always has that power against people. There's too much gold and silver on the mainland, Mexico and Peru and so on. So Trinidad was just something out there. However, the British must have seen something in Trinidad, and they did come to us, to the island in 1797, and took over the island of Trinidad as their possession. Some agriculture had started with the French in 1783, slaves were brought in, but in earnest, the agriculture already started on a plantation basis with the coming of the English, the British people. We find then that estates were set up, everybody was ready to go with agriculture, slave labor was available, but lo and behold, 10 years after the British took over, the law was passed in England to end the slave trade. And so people couldn't bring slaves to Trinidad anymore. The planters were in a bit of a quandary as yet as to what's going to happen. And what did happen? In 1838, slavery was abolished. And so when slavery was abolished, in that year, no new slaves were brought to Trinidad until the other colonies of Britain. No more slaves came in. However, people always tried to cheat the system, and so they were capturing slaves and bringing them to Trinidad. They were trying to do that, and the British said, no, you can't do that. You have to give us a registration of your slaves. And so Africans in Trinidad can trace their genealogy to T71, which is a list of 65,000 African slaves to Trinidad between 1812 and about 1816 or so. So information is there in Trinidad for the tracing of African genealogy as well. We also know that the end of slavery meant that the British the planters were in a severe dilemma, despite the fact that they were compensated. Not the slaves were compensated, but the owners of the slaves were compensated. So this severe labor shortage created quite a problem. They tried to solve this problem by having indentured Africans coming as a result of those capturing the Africans who were being caught by other nations to take to their colonies and so on. European labor was tried with the people from Portugal, Madeira, and also from Ireland. Africans came to Trinidad with the War of 1812 to 14, although that was not the end of slavery yet, but some of those were tried as well. And the Chinese were brought in 1806, and then some Chinese indentured came between 1852 and 1865. But still, none could adequately satisfy the planters. So therefore, we find that what could they do? Well, the standard is set already in places like the Isle of Gabon, which is today Reunion Island, and also mentioned by Saha in his book in 1970, should actually be, sorry, track again. And in Mauritius in 1834, in British Guyana in 1838, indentured labor, indentureship, started in those places and was a reasonable amount of success. And so when the planters in Trinidad heard about this, if we check the Port of Spain Gazette, for example, between that period of 1814 to 1845, we'll see that advertisements were actually screaming out to bring the creeds, as we were called. It's the word that's not used too much anymore, but that was what was happening. They were saying, bring the creeds first. And in India, for example, there were the push factors that led to this movement, because land tenure, with the heavy taxation being done on the Indian, the zamindari system in 1785, or from their time, and the royalty system of 1830, and with the Lagan, which is another tax from 1857, caused great bankruptcy and property seizure of many Indian families. So there was a serious problem for those people. It led to bondage and serfdom, sharecropping, so well illustrated. I don't know if some of you should read this novel by Kamala Makandaya. It's been around for a while. It's called Necked in the Sea. It was published way back in 1954. I visit that every 5 years or so. I like to read it over, because it's a very moving account of what could happen to a sharecropping family. Crops for British industry like jute, indigo, took precedence over food crops. And this exacerbated the famines that we mentioned before throughout the 19th century India. And then there were other push factors in their industries. For example, destructive tariffs, we would like to hear, we would like to hear too much these days. Levy on textiles, handicrafts, jewelry. And so India became, which was a previous exporter of these kinds of industrial products, became an importer. And so there was massive unemployment in India because of this. There were taxes for British wars, such as the Anglo-Afghan War, the Anglo-Sikh War, the Anglo-Burmese War, the Opium Wars. All of these caused taxation against the Indian population. But perhaps the biggest war, the biggest thing that affected indentureship, although it had started before then, was the mutiny, the Great Mutiny of 1857-58. Because as Professor Jar said in 1985 in his treatise, he said that when villagers fled from fear of vengeance, when laborers and their families came walking sometimes as much as 40 days to the Calcutta depot to see what could we do about the present situation. Indentureship was seen as a viable solution to the whole problem. And one thing that helped in the case of Indian indentureship to the different colonies is that it was mostly done by the same colonial power. Of course, the French did it as well, the Dutch did it, but the vast majority of the migration took place with British help and British ships and so on, towards the British colonies. Transport were organized by British ships. Some even made here, was mentioned in Newcastle. And then the funny thing, I saw something, I knew a ship called Newcastle came to Trinidad in 1865 from Nigeria. I knew that ship was there. When I checked it, it was not built in Newcastle. It was built in Sunderland. Is it the same? Is it the same? Two different places. Yeah. So Sunderland built your Newcastle ship. You didn't yourself. It's interesting to see. And I said, on Wikipedia and other things online that I checked, there's no record of a Newcastle going to Trinidad. But we have it in our general registers, and we have the ship registers, and we have the people who came on that ship. And I have worked out some stories in those, some families in that ship. So they can't say that. That's not correct. But that's what you face sometimes. Genealogists face that. You get a lot of flack about things that don't happen, but genealogists, unlike historians, and I apologize, I may not like that. We are nitty-gritty. We are fine-teeth comb people. Every document is important for us. And I might throw out something here right now. What I'm also trying to do before I leave this place, I don't only mean Newcastle, I mean this place. There are a few ships missing in our documents in Trinidad. And I've been trying for the longest while. I've tried the National Archives in London, I've tried the British Library, I've tried the British Museum, I need to check them again. I want to try Lloyd's of London. I tried India, I even paid people to get, of the 2,000 or so missing people, I've been able to get about 100. Well, 100 is it? 100 is good enough because it means that it's there. Please look for it. We want it in Trinidad. We want to complete that whole process, that whole 147,592 that was mentioned. I want to get all of this again. Then I would be satisfied. Then rules were set up within the indentureship to try and lessen the hardships that were felt by the barbarity of the slaves, of the slave trade and slavery conditions. Terrible conditions there. Yet people like Hugh Tinker, for example, described indentureship as a new system of slavery. And what some of the argument was like this. They said that the slaves were going to be the property, I hope I'm not mixing up the two periods, slavery is studied, but during the time of slavery, slaves were given some time to acclimatize, a month or so, because they were going to be there for life. Whereas in indentureship, the Indians were only going to be there for 5 years. And so they tried to squeeze every ounce of labor that they could get from them. And in doing that, they would lessen their wages and lengthen their working periods and so on. So all of these conditions were against some of the indentured people. There were some things, the infrastructure, for example, like for the slaves, the barracks, the mills, the hospitals and so on, these were built for slave labor, so they stayed around to be used by the indentured workers. Now the documentation of slaves, of Indians. I'd like to get into that a little bit because family history is greatly assisted. Now I've founded the British quite a bit. You see that? In the last few minutes I've been talking. But I must thank them for the excellent documentation that they have done for us. And they've done that for many other fields. I know that started with the Doomsday Book and even before that. There was pretty good. The Doomsday Book was the start of scientific genealogy, by the way, when people could trace back to a particular ancestor. But now we find that with our documents in Trinidad, and I think it's similar to some of the other places that got indentured workers, there were ship registers that brought the documents. Each person, each Indian was given a page in the ship register. So for example, we know from 1845 to 1858, we don't know too much because of the documents were not totally done. But from 1859 onward, we find that the village was included. So that meant that you could trace your families back to the village from which they came and so find present-day relatives, which we have done for the two prime ministers of Indian origin in Trinidad and for other people as well. Myself included, I have been able to find 3 sets of my own ancestors because it's my great-great-grandparents that came. So that spreads out the family tree quite a bit as far as ancestry is concerned. So we have things like the ship registers, as I mentioned. We have the general registers. These are roll book type registers where about 30 to 50 names are on a page. We have about 20 volumes of these. We have many other registers that can help regular history people, family history and so on. These are things like the estate registers, the bounty registers, returning registers, remittances, crown lands and so on. All of these are registers that we have in Trinidad. Not the total period for some of these. For example, the remittances we only have them for 6 years. You can't tell me that in the 72 years of the indentureship and the period before that people didn't send money to their families in India. I think that they said it's wrong. So those are some of the things that we look at. So documenting of indentureship in Trinidad, I could give you a little bit of statistics 127 voyages that were made using 154 ships, because some ships are the Ganges, which was mentioned before. Different incarnations of the Ganges. Did about 15 voyages, and some others did about 10 and so on. But the very first ship, the Fatima was made only one voyage, and so on. These things, as you can see. They were, even the people who died, their documents on the voyages, their documents came to Trinidad. And that's very helpful to genealogists in particular, because when I trace a family, I need to speak to the elders of the family and build what I have developed, something called an arrival scenario. You know, different points that must be satisfied, criteria building that will be satisfied in the documentation process. You know, so these are some of the things that we look at. So the dead people, I remember one case where somebody told me that their great-grandfather was coming with his brother. The brother died on the road. And that great-grandfather, his name was Rajab. There were many people with that name. There was only one other brother who died on the road. So I knew that was correct. But there are other criteria. You have to set the ages and all of these things must come in there as well. 5-year contracts were allotted after this, which the Indian could re-indent it for 1 year. They could seek their own livelihood, or they could return to India. Sugarcane, of course, was the most important cultivation, refining, and as well. And then there were also cocoa and coffee plantations, as well as coconut plantations. Some places had, I think, Guyana had rice plantations as well. I also know that some places had rubber plantations as well. So, what were the contributions of the indented workers in Trinidad? Many people say they rescued the agriculture industry in Trinidad because, as I mentioned earlier, the sugar planters were in ruins, they didn't know what next to do. With the coming of the indented Indians, things started to show. And they also brought with them the Indians, the other skills in pottery, jewelry, tailors and so on came as well. Foods like roti, which some of us have understand, sweets, and delicate doubles and so on, that you might have heard about. Music, business, small and large, education, civil service, politics, and so on. So all of these are areas into which Indians have gotten themselves, into nearly every area. I think also into crime as well. Yeah. So the diaspora connection, because that's some of what we want now. Indians, according to its people, something called an OCI card, which is an overseas citizen of India card. If you can prove your Indian ancestry through documentation, not through DNA. A lot of people say that it should be through DNA as well. You have to be able to make a connection to your great-grandfather or some ancestor. And you also have to build a paper trail of good papers especially, leading from you to your arriving ancestor before you could qualify to get your overseas Indian certificate, overseas citizen of India certificate. There's also something every year, and I think it's every 2 years now, called a Pravasi conference in January. The date that Mahatma Gandhi returned to India. I think it's January 9th. So that's the date of return. That period is when this conference is held, and people from all over the Indian diaspora are invited to come to India to celebrate in this conference. I remember the first one was held in 2003, and I was asked to bring one of the survivors of indentureship. I was fortunate to work with the last 100 or so of them. And because I took him, I was able to meet people like Ravi Shankar and some of the leading screen stars and so on, because they were excited to see him, and I was a chaperone, so I was very close contact with them. Re-indented to other colonies. Okay, what happens sometimes, I mentioned this in documentation. What happens is that some people, after indented to Trinidad, they might have gone back to India and then re-indented to another colony, and vice versa. And so if their documentation is not around, they could check with other people, other colonies to see if their documentation might be there. Or sometimes siblings could go to a different, in my own family, I'm sure many of the people who come from other places, I have a sibling who has gone to New York, one has gone come to England, a couple of them have gone to Canada, and some of them still in Trinidad. So you see, what could have happened in indentured times, and it did happen, because the last book I wrote was a fellow called Baliram Maharaj, the president of the mayor of Marima, and his cousin, his Indian cousin, who we had worked out, showed me a document where he found out that his grandfather had gone to Fiji, but his grandfather returned to India. When you look at the two emigration passes that were done in India, they were almost identical, except the names were different. The names of the father, the names were different for the person, but the name of the father, the name of the people, the caste, and all that we were the same. Yeah. And also, the diaspora connection can help us in vertical and lateral tracing of families. We could trace back to India, or we could trace across the diaspora if we want to. Okay, so I want to thank you very much, but I want to close on a little story of indentureship that's one of my favorites. I didn't have it on my PowerPoint yet, I forgot to mention it. You know, during the indentureship, all kinds of crazy stories happen. But one that stands out the most for me is one of my survivors that told me the story, and I checked it out in the documents and it worked out. Her mother was married when she was 10 years old. It was not unusual. Maybe it's still not, it's not unusual. And what happens in that situation is that the bride goes back to her mother's home and stays until she reaches the age of puberty. And then she comes back to her husband, which she did. When she came back to her husband, just about a week later, he disappeared. They couldn't find him at all. They tried everything. They looked all around for him and he could not be found. So, they started to blame her and said, this is your fault. He was here with us for almost 20 years. Now that you have come, he's disappeared. It's your fault. And she said, no, I don't know what he's gone. I'm lost just like everybody else. And then about a week or two later, she realized that she's pregnant for him. And her mother-in-law said, you must have brought that child when you were coming here. And she said, no man has ever touched me. How could you say that? But quarrels and so on continued and nagging and so on. Over the years, she couldn't go back. Her mother was about 50 miles away, her parents. And so she didn't know what to do. And eventually, after about 3 years or so, when the child was about 3-4 years old, she couldn't take it. Her mother couldn't take it anymore. So one night, she took her child and went away. Just left. And she was walking for days in the sun and the rain and everything else, talking to the child, not knowing that there are these people in India called the recruiters, and they were listening to her, what she was saying to the child. And then they said, one of their people said, I can take you to your mother's home. I know that place. I will take you. So she agreed. And the next thing she knew, she was on a ship bound for Trinidad. And she was told on the ship, but don't worry, nothing will happen. You just go home for like a year or for the most, and then we come back and we bring you back, take you to your mother's house. And all you'll have to do in Trinidad, as I told so many other Indians, you just have to sift some sugar and you'll make a lot of money. You don't have any hard work to do. When she came to Trinidad, she was put on a cocoa estate instead. I mentioned the estate. And on that estate, there were only scorpions, and snakes, and centipedes, and so on. And the child was almost bitten by a snake. So the mother didn't know what to do. This is not what you promised me. You said I'm going to go on a sugar estate. So a friendly overseer overheard the conversation and said, you know what? I'll get you transferred. And he did get a transfer to the child. to sugarcane estate. And while she was there, the children were left at home, many times unsupervised, while their parents went out in the fields to work. And when they came back, and one day, while this child was working with the other children and no supervision around, she fell and got a deep cut on her leg. And blood was spurting and all of that. She was crying, screaming, and the other children were screaming because they didn't know what to do. And there was a guy going to the mill. Every estate had its own sugarcane mill. And he ran quickly and said, "Don't worry, don't worry." And he put some tobacco, that was a cure in those days, in the wool, tied it up, put her in a bed. And the evening the mother came home, and when she heard what happened, she was all in tears and crying, and what happened to my child, so on. And then she went to thank the man who turned out to be her husband, the child's father. So these are the kinds of stories that you get from studying in genealogy. It's amazing, there are many, many more like this. But it was what the thing of genealogy gives us. It doesn't give us too much of the analysis on that history we do. Just to tell you that in there, I should finish up now by telling you that the whole indenture process in Trinidad finished in 1917 due to a lot of factors, one of which is that the demand for indentured movers had fallen. Because if you look at the statistics of the ships, if you look at the amount of people, the Mutler, for example, in 1908, 1907, wrote about 847 people, whereas the same Mutler a few years later was only bringing about 400-500 people to Trinidad. So obviously the demand is falling, and so they went down. So you find therefore that was one cause, and people like Gandhi and so on were saying that this indentureship system is not a good system, people are being ill-treated, we need to stop it, and so on. And other industries was being set up in India, and so the demand fell, and there were, a lot of people wanted to go still, but other factors would have caused it as well. But these are some that have caused it. So therefore, indentureship was a very, very important period in the whole diaspora. There's a whole diaspora connection, why people came to these colonies, mainly due to the demand for labor at the end of slavery. When people could no longer have slaves, and so indentureship started. In Trinidad, for example, it lasted for 72 years. And so I want to again take this opportunity to thank you all for having me here. It was a great